This is part 3 of chapter 1. Alright, so right now what we're going to do is, in terms of speaking about the origins of psychology, we're going to take a look at the past, some historic references. First, we'll start with structuralism. Structuralism established a model that's for studying mental processes scientifically, whereas functionalism, here, this is expanding the scope of psychology that would include research on emotions as well as observable behaviors that's initiated through psychological testing movement, as well as influenced modern education and the industry as a whole. When we speak about the psychoanalytic school, now many of you, I'm quite sure, have heard of Sigmund Freud. Well, Sigmund Freud is responsible for psychoanalytic, okay? Uh, he provided a basis for a system of therapy that's known as psychoanalysis. And as we go through more within the chapters and further on down the semesters, you'll get to learn even more about what Freud's philosophy and ideals were in terms of psychoanalysis. Right now, what I like to do is talk a little bit about modern psychology's 7 perspectives, okay? Um, Here, this is where it talks about how they developed and what we generally use as our theoretical orientation, so to speak. So, first one, foremost, let's go back to Freud. Psychoanalysis had morphed, so to speak, into and developed into what we now call psychodynamics. Here we're looking at the unconscious drives, we'll look at motives of why and conflicts that people may experience, particularly through childhood, and how it can impact them as an adult as far as with their development, their way of feeling, behaviors. Excuse me. Behavioral, speaking of, this particular paradigm is now more objective. With behavioralists, they look simply at the actions. They don't really focus on the emotive part as far as how you feel, but based upon how you feel, what they want to know is what it makes you do, how you react or act toward different things. So it's the objective, observable, how you interact with the environmental influences, and how it would have you to behave. Here they look more at how the stimulus response occurs between relationships and those interactions and the consequences of those said behaviors. And we'll talk more about it. When we speak about humanistic, this is one of the pioneers in this paradigm would be Carl Rogers. Here it's discussing about free will, about self-actualization, which we'll talk about Maslow, who actually worked a lot in this area in terms of self-actualization, as well as looking at human nature as a whole and how we react and respond naturally and hopefully positively when we're attempting to grow as a person. Cognitive, this perspective looks at how we think, how we would do problem solving, how we speak our language, information processing. Uh, some things that we'll look at is how we might interpret something or think about, how we might really, what's the best way of saying it? You never have those thoughts where no matter what you think you're doing, you think you're doing it wrong. Well, this is what we call irrational thinking. And a lot of different experiences that we may have may cause one to have irrational thoughts. Cognitive psychology is one of those areas that we would specifically look at that term, that those type of scenarios, and attempt to work with an individual who may demonstrate those type of symptoms. The biological, here we look at the genetic and biological processes and how our brain reacts to the environment, how things that we might ingest and eat can actually cause our brain to do certain things. We look at the communication of the brain, how it reacts. Uh, when we talk about evolutionary, here we're talking about how one adapts to the environment in terms of evolution in our regards to our behavior as well as our mental processes. The socio-cultural, just as it's speaking about cultural differences and similarities as well as how we react to one another socially. These are different interactions that will be looked upon in this particular paradigm. So there's a lot, and these are just seven of the main ones. In reality, there are so many different other theoretical frameworks that we work from, and new ones come up all the time. So now, the biopsychosocial model, okay, this is where we may be looking at the biological processes, that being the genetics, brain functioning, neurotransmitters, the evolution of how we've grown and become advanced as humans. There's psychological factors that are involved. That would be how we learn, our ways of thinking, how we feel, the emotions, our personality constructs, as well as motivation. The social forces, this is where it's covering family, school, culture, ethnicity, social class, as well as politics. We call this particular model is what I'd say has elevated the term eclectic. Uh, Earlier in my career, I'm a clinical psychologist by trade. However, I do not just simply go with the training of psychodynamics, I'm sorry, but I do not simply go by psychodynamics. I tend to use interventions that's going to be sufficient for treatment for the person individually. Therefore, I take more of a biopsychosocial model. We used to call it eclectic. Uh, so it's basically being able to take these different viewpoints and see how it would relate to an individual specifically and work within those paradigms. Now, let's speak a little bit about the science of psychology. All right, so biggest thing that we do and what we work with is research. And there's two types that I want you to be aware of. That being basic, which is typically conducted in universities such as ours. They could be held within research laboratories where researchers would be interested in attempting to advance general scientific understanding, that being the knowledge for its own sake without no real world uses. Discoveries that would be linking aggression to testosterone, for example, or genes, or being able to look at learning and other factors that came primarily using basic research. Now, you remember those four goals that I spoke about earlier? Well, when we're speaking about goals, basic research would help us in terms of being able to describe, to explain, as well as predict. Now, excuse me. When we're speaking about applied research, it's generally going to be conducted outside of the laboratory, and it meets the fourth goal of psychology, which would be change. Okay, here is where we attempt to make changes within human behavior. For example, with applied research, it's more designed programming for conflict resolution as well as counseling for people who are maybe a victim or a perpetrator of violence. It's also been used to generate important safety and design improvements in terms of what you drive, our automobiles. Think about it. You ever see those safety tests? Well, those are some of those things that we do. Um, Utilized with airplanes, stovetop burners, for example, as well as the cell phones that we use, our keyboards, ergonomics, All of this comes from applied research that we as psychologists we've been able to do. All right, so now looking more closely at that scientific method, think of it as more of a cyclical as well as cumulative scientific progress. And it comes from repeatedly challenging as well as revising existing theories as well as being able to build up new ones. We take the term meta-analysis. Here, this is when different studies will look at contradictory type of findings. Investigators, they might average or combine the results of all such studies and then reach conclusions about the overall weight of the evidence that they received. Theories are evidence-based and they're generally subject to a rigorous type of testing. So take a look at the slide. Excuse me. Oh. Think about, have you done a research project yet? Well, whenever we have questions, that's what research starts, the process. The first thing we do is we'll have a question. One thing you might have a question about is how people react to the temperature while they're trying to study. That might be a question. So then what you would do is, now that you have a question, you're going to want to formulate this by first looking at seeing if anybody else done it, which we call the literature review. A literature review is basically being able to see why we need to answer the question, or if the question has been answered, why hasn't it been answered in a way that we would all understand. The literature review basically is your foundation on how to go about answering your question. Okay. The second thing you'll move into is what we call a testable hypothesis. Now we are constructing the question. We're actually delving deeper and breaking down the question even further to find the answers that we're looking for. Well, now that you have a working hypothesis, you're going to want to create a research design to be able to start gathering information or data to be able to answer those questions. Once you've designed it, we now would start data collection as well as analysis. And in this section, this is where we start taking our time to look for participants. We'll talk about participants and we'll talk about how we request for voluntary participation. But when we gather our participants, we gather the data that they give us, that observable type of data that we can collect. Therefore, once we have that, we now can start answering. Did many people find themselves not able to perform because they were too cold, or was it the opposite? This is where we will start having that information. As a psychologist, once I've gathered the data and aggregated the results, I would then analyze that data. And from there, well, the biggest thing we like to do in psychology is share the information. Once we share this information, others can either expound on it, go further with it, or it might answer some questions that they've had and didn't have the answers to. That's done through publication. Okay. Finally, we move toward theory development. I may have now discovered a way that we can actually help be an agent of change. Remember that final goal. And create a theory on how to work with people in terms of knowing that they are cold, how they can work toward be still performing at the optimum levels. That can give you a little glimpse of the scientific method. I'm going to stop here and we will pick up again in part 4.